The wind howled as Sarah stood at the entrance of the old, weather-beaten house. Its crumbling exterior seemed to whisper secrets from the past, and she could feel a cold chill creeping down her spine. The house, nestled deep in the woods, was a place people spoke about in hushed tones. No one dared to go near it, yet there it stood, its windows dark, the paint peeling like the layers of a forgotten history. Sarah had heard the rumors, the stories of people who had vanished without a trace, the mysterious deaths, the inexplicable happenings. But she never believed in such things. After all, she was a woman of logic, of science, of reason. There was no such thing as ghosts or curses, she told herself. The logical explanation was always the most probable one. Yet, as she stood there, staring at the decaying house before her, her heart raced with an unsettling unease she couldn't quite shake off. Her uncle, who had lived in the nearby town, had recently passed away under strange circumstances. No one could explain how he died, and there were whispers that his death was linked to the house. Sarah, curious and driven by a need for answers, had made the decision to visit. She had no idea what she was about to walk into. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wood as the wind pushed through the cracks. The front door, surprisingly ajar, seemed to beckon her inside. Despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back, she stepped across the threshold. The moment Sarah crossed the threshold, the air inside shifted. It was thicker, colder. The house seemed to breathe, as if it were alive. Her footsteps echoed in the hollow, cavernous space. The once grand foyer was now a ghost of its former self, the wallpaper peeling, the furniture covered in layers of dust. The grand chandelier overhead hung precariously, its crystals clinking in the wind, producing an eerie melody. "Uncle?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she called out, though she knew no one would answer. She moved through the house, her footsteps leading her deeper into the heart of the mansion. The house was more than just old. It felt wrong. The air seemed heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite place. The walls, once filled with the laughter of a family, now seemed to be holding their breath, waiting. As she walked further, a sense of foreboding grew stronger. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every corner she turned, every creaking floorboard beneath her feet, seemed to whisper, to murmur, to draw her deeper into the house. Finally, Sarah reached the living room. The walls were lined with portraits of people she didn't recognize. Their faces were solemn, their eyes empty, as if staring straight through her. They felt wrong. She shuddered, her fingers brushing against the frames as she passed, the cold metal sending a shiver up her spine. Then, she noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, a door stood ajar, leading to a dark hallway. The door was cracked open, but the hallway beyond was shrouded in complete darkness. The shadows seemed to move, twisting unnaturally, like something was waiting on the other side. Sarah's heart raced, her breathing shallow as she stared at the darkened passage. The house was silent, but Sarah swore she could hear something. Whispers, faint, barely audible murmurs, like a crowd of people talking from just beyond the darkness. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as though the house was speaking to her, with every fiber of her being telling her to leave. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could feel the chill of the room before her hand even touched the doorknob. As the door creaked open, a gust of cold air rushed out, extinguishing the dim light from the living room and plunging her into complete darkness. "Hello?" Sarah's voice trembled, but the only response was silence. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent, as if they were trying to reach her, warn her, or call her. She stepped into the dark hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The floor beneath her feet felt uneven, as though the house itself was shifting. The walls seemed to close in around her, and every step she took made the whispers grow louder, more frantic. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her, as if the house were alive, its very walls pulsating with an unseen force. A faint light flickered ahead, drawing her toward it, and despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back, she moved forward. Each step felt like an eternity, as if she were walking deeper into the very bowels of the house, into its heart. The light led her to a small room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, but she could see nothing through the crack. The whispers were now deafening, filling her ears with unintelligible voices. The air felt heavier, colder, and as Sarah pushed the door open, the light flickered out completely, leaving her in total darkness. Sarah. Her name was spoken softly, almost like a whisper, but it was clear. It was her uncle's voice. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice sounded strange, distorted, as if coming from somewhere far away. "Uncle?" she whispered, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. There was no response. Just as Sarah stepped forward, a cold hand grabbed her wrist, its icy fingers tightening around her skin. Her heart stopped as a feeling of sheer terror washed over her. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. Then she heard it, a low, guttural growl like an animal in pain. The whispers turned to screams, screams of agony, of fear, of souls trapped in this very house. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating with the tortured cries of the lost. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, its form barely visible in the dim light. It moved slowly, dragging itself toward her, its face twisted in agony. It reached out toward Sarah, its eyes empty, hollow, like two dark voids staring into her soul. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She tried to move, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure reached her, its cold, clammy hand brushing against her cheek. "Help me," it whispered, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "Help us all." And then the darkness closed in. The darkness seemed to suffocate Sarah as she stood frozen in the small room. The cold hand on her cheek, clammy and unnatural, was enough to send a wave of terror through her body. She wanted to scream, to flee, but her limbs felt as though they had been paralyzed by some unseen force. The oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her, its ancient walls groaning in response to the horrors within. The figure before her seemed to materialize out of thin air, its form flickering and shifting like a shadow. It moved toward her with agonizing slowness, dragging itself forward as though it was bound by some invisible chain. The air in the room grew colder, and Sarah could see her breath puffing in the frigid space, swirling like smoke in the dim light. She finally managed to break free from her paralysis, pulling her arm away from the figure's cold grip. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall behind her with a sharp thud. She gasped for air, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling with fear. The figure's hollow eyes met hers, its face a grotesque mask of despair. It didn't answer her question. Instead, it whispered again, its voice low and broken. "Help us, please." The whisper sent a chill down Sarah's spine, and a terrible realization began to form in her mind. This wasn't just any ghost, any restless spirit. This was something far worse, something far more dangerous. These were not souls seeking peace. They were trapped, tormented, and bound to this house. Without warning, The figure lunged forward, its hands outstretched toward her. Sarah gasped, her heart racing as she scrambled backward, her feet slipping on the cold, uneven floor. She turned and bolted for the door, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She had no idea where she was running or what she hoped to accomplish by escaping, but her instincts told her that the only way to survive was to get out, away from whatever nightmare this house had become. But as she reached the doorway, a cold gust of wind slammed it shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her. The darkness of the room seemed to swallow her whole, and the figure's whispers grew louder, more insistent. She turned in circles, her pulse thudding in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers were coming from every direction, surrounding her, overwhelming her senses. She couldn't escape them. "Please, I can't help you," Sarah choked out, her voice cracking with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The figure's hollow eyes seemed to stare through her, and as it took another step forward, Sarah felt a sudden, terrifying sense of dread flood her body. There was something horribly wrong with this place, something far beyond what she had imagined. These souls, these lost, tormented souls, weren't merely haunting the house. They were feeding off the fear of anyone who dared enter. The figure stopped just a few feet away from her, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, a horrible rictus grin that sent a shiver down her spine. It opened its mouth and spoke, the voice a rasping whisper that felt like it was coming from the very walls of the house. "Don't you understand?" the figure croaked. "We are all trapped here, trapped by the one who brought us to this place. The one who caused our suffering." Sarah's mind raced. The one who caused their suffering. Was it her uncle? The man who had died under such mysterious circumstances? Suddenly, a new voice echoed through the room, so clear and chilling that it made Sarah freeze in place. "You shouldn't have come here, child." The voice was soft, yet laced with an unnatural authority. It was a woman's voice, calm yet filled with an eerie finality. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the source of the voice, but the figure was gone. In its place stood a woman, a tall, thin figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as though she had stepped out of another time. The woman's face was pale and drawn, her hair dark and flowing around her shoulders like a black veil. Her eyes were deep and hollow, her expression one of sorrow and regret. She didn't move, but her presence seemed to fill the room with an oppressive weight. Who are you?" Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am one of them," the woman said softly, her voice almost a sigh. "One of the lost souls who dwell here, the ones who came before you, and the ones who will come after." Sarah's mind reeled. The woman's words didn't make sense. She was a ghost, yes, but why was she speaking to her? And why did she say there would be others? Was Sarah meant to be trapped here, like the souls before her? The woman's eyes softened, and she took a small step forward, her gaze locking onto Sarah's. "You are in great danger," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "This house does not let go of its guests. It holds their souls, feeds off their fear, and binds them to the walls of this place for eternity. No one leaves once they've entered." Sarah's heart raced. The woman's words were like a death sentence. She was trapped. She knew it in her bones. There was no way out. "Who's behind this?" Sarah asked, trying to steady her voice despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "Who brought you here? Who trapped you?" The woman's expression darkened, and she looked away, as if the question pained her. "It is the clockmaker," she whispered. "The one who built this house, the one who cursed us all. He has control over time itself, and he uses it to keep us here. Forever." The clockmaker. Sarah had heard that name, hadn't she? It had been whispered in the town. The strange, reclusive man who had disappeared years ago, leaving behind only rumors and mystery. But what did he have to do with the souls trapped in this house? Before Sarah could ask more, a loud bang echoed through the house, like a door slamming shut. The woman turned sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "He's here," she whispered urgently. "You must leave. Now." But before Sarah could even think of a response, the house groaned again, and a shadow fell across the room. The woman's face twisted in horror as she stepped backward, retreating into the darkness. The last thing Sarah saw before the lights flickered and went out was the woman's eyes, wide, terrified, as she disappeared into the blackness. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. And in the silence that followed, Sarah realized the terrifying truth. She was not alone. The house, once filled with eerie silence, now hummed with an unnatural energy, as if someone was watching Sarah from the shadows. The flickering lights cast strange, distorted shapes across the walls, and the floor beneath her feet creaked with every step she took. She could still feel the lingering presence of the ghostly woman, her warning echoing in her mind like a chant. "He's here." Sarah's heart raced as she cautiously moved through the darkened hallway. The air was thick with the stench of decay and mildew, and the floorboards groaned in protest with each step she took. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape, but something kept her rooted to this place. There was no going back now. She had no idea who this clockmaker was or why he had trapped the souls of so many in this house. But one thing was certain. She was part of something much larger and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Her breath hitched in her throat as she heard the distant sound of a ticking clock. It was faint at first, like the echo of a forgotten memory, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't just any clock. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic tick-tock of a timepiece far older than anything she had ever seen before. The sound seemed to draw her closer, as if it was calling her, urging her forward. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning like a maze. There were doors on either side, but none of them seemed to lead anywhere, just more darkness and shadows. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. She couldn't stop. Not now. She needed to find answers to understand what was happening and, most importantly, how she could escape. As the ticking grew louder, she noticed something strange. There was a faint glow emanating from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. It was a soft, yellow light that seemed to pulse like the beating of a heart, beckoning her toward it. The rest of the house felt suffocating, oppressive, but this light seemed different, felt almost comforting. Without thinking, Sarah found herself walking toward the door at the end of the hallway, her feet carrying her forward with an almost magnetic pull. She reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open with a sound that made her flinch. Inside, the room was bathed in a golden glow, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. It was a small, dimly lit room, almost like a study or workshop, filled with strange artifacts and clock parts scattered across the floor. In the center of the room stood a massive grandfather clock, its dark wooden frame adorned with intricate carvings. The clock towered over her, its hands frozen in place at midnight. And yet, the ticking sound persisted, louder than ever, like a heartbeat trapped in time. Sarah stepped closer, her pulse quickening as she examined the clock. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift before her eyes, forming grotesque, twisted faces. Faces of those who had once lived, now trapped within the very fabric of this cursed timepiece. They seemed to watch her, their eyes hollow and filled with an ancient, unknowable sorrow. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the clock, but as her fingers brushed against its surface, the room seemed to shift. The light flickered violently, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls, and the sound of the ticking grew deafening. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble as if the house itself was alive, reacting to her presence. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The light flickered once more and went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could hear someone, breathing in the darkness with her. The air was cold now, far colder than before. The temperature dropped rapidly, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her like dark fingers. A voice, low and rasping, whispered through the blackness. "Time is a gift, child," it said. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. "But it is also a curse." Sarah's heart raced as she spun around, trying to find the source of the voice. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't see anything. No person, no shape, no movement, just endless shadows. The room felt like it was closing in on her, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Suddenly, the clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The chimes echoed through the room, each one louder and more ominous than the last. With each chime, the shadows seemed to stretch further, growing more oppressive, as though the house itself was pulling her deeper into its grip. "Do you hear it, child?" The voice continued, its tone growing darker, more sinister. "The clock is ticking, and every tick brings you closer to your fate. There is no escape." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary house. This was no ordinary clock, and she was not alone. With a burst of courage, Sarah backed away from the clock, her mind racing for an escape. But the door was gone. The hallway outside had vanished, replaced by nothing but endless darkness. Panic rose in her chest as she realized that the room she had entered was now a trap, a prison. The clock was the key, and it held the power to control everything. Before she could react, the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she was falling into the void, her body weightless, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The darkness swallowed her whole, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Sarah found herself standing in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by nothing but a vast, empty void. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and there was no sign of the clock, no sign of the house, and no sign of the terrifying figure that had haunted her. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, the words lost in the vast emptiness. A shadow shifted in the distance, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. The figure moved closer, its outline slowly becoming clearer. It was a man, a tall, imposing figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face hidden in shadow. And in his hands he held a pocket watch, the ticking sound deafening in the silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew, without a doubt, that this was the clockmaker, and he was about to make her time run out. Sarah's heart raced as the shadowed figure drew closer. The ticking of the pocket watch echoed louder in the stillness, filling her ears with a sound that was both rhythmic and unnervingly ominous. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air around her growing colder by the second. The man, no, the clockmaker, was closer now, his face still hidden in the darkness, but his presence felt overwhelming. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were frozen in place. It was as if the very void she stood in was trapping her, binding her to this moment. Her body refused to respond, as though some unseen force had placed a heavy weight upon her chest, pressing her down into the cold emptiness. The ticking grew louder, reverberating through her body, matching the frantic beat of her heart. Each tick seemed to remind her that time was slipping away, and she couldn't stop it. "Do you feel it?" The clockmaker's voice was low, its cadence slow and deliberate, as though each word was being measured. It was the same rasping whisper she had heard before, only now it was accompanied by the rhythmic ticking of his pocket watch. "You can't escape time, child. It's not just a measure of hours and minutes. It's a force. And once it's in your hands, it controls you." Sarah's mind raced. She had been trapped in this strange place before, but this was different. She could sense the weight of something terrible looming over her. The figure in front of her seemed to be a living embodiment of that weight. The clockmaker raised the pocket watch, the faint light from an unknown source reflecting off its surface. It was an old, tarnished thing, but the glow from it was undeniable, casting an eerie sheen on the surrounding darkness. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to force her feet to move, but the darkness around her was suffocating. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. The clockmaker's laughter echoed around her, hollow and unsettling. It was not a sound of amusement, but one of knowing. He knew something that she didn't. "Time, child. It's always been about time." The clockmaker's voice dropped to a near whisper, but Sarah could still feel the weight of each word, as though they were being etched into her soul. "But I see you're not ready to understand yet. You'll learn soon enough. Just remember, the clock's hands don't care about you. It only cares about what you give up in the end." With that, the figure turned, slowly retreating into the distance, but the ticking of the watch didn't stop. It followed her, echoing through the void, amplifying her fear. Sarah strained against the grip of the darkness, trying to force her legs to move, but it was no use. The void seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending sea of nothingness. As the figure disappeared into the darkness, she found herself standing in the same place she had been when she first arrived in this nightmare realm, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt even more so. A voice broke the silence, a voice she recognized. It was the woman from the house, the one who had warned her. "Don't listen to him, Sarah." The woman's voice rang out, soft but urgent. "The clock, it doesn't just trap souls, it feeds on them. You're not just trapped here, you're part of the curse." Sarah turned, desperately searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there, only darkness. Still, the words cut through her fear like a sharp blade. "Who are you? What do you mean?" Sarah cried out, her voice trembling with panic. But there was no answer. The air around her seemed to swallow her words, leaving her with only the distant sound of the ticking clock. It felt as though time itself had stopped, frozen in a moment where nothing moved and nothing existed but her and the weight of the clock's power. She reached out in all directions, but no matter how far she stretched, there was nothing, just more emptiness. And then, just as suddenly as before, the darkness shifted. A door appeared in the distance, its outline glowing faintly, beckoning her to move forward. Sarah hesitated, but something in her instinctively told her to go. She couldn't stay in this nothingness forever. Her legs finally moved, and she forced herself to walk toward the door. The closer she got, the stronger the sensation of dread gnawed at her. Something was waiting on the other side, but she couldn't turn back now. With one last breath, she opened the door. The room beyond was dimly lit, but there was an overwhelming sense of familiarity to it. It was a room that felt wrong. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with clocks of all sizes. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, and ornate timepieces of various designs. They all ticked in unison, creating an eerie, rhythmic sound that resonated deep in Sarah's bones. As she stepped further into the room, she saw a figure sitting in the corner. It was the woman again. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow. She looked as though she had been waiting for Sarah to arrive. The woman spoke again, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You should never have come here. The clock, it's not just a trap. It's the heart of this house. Controls everything." Sarah tried to approach her, but something held her back. A force, invisible but strong, kept her at a distance. She could feel the weight of the woman's gaze, and it made her skin crawl. "The souls you see," the woman continued, "they're not trapped in time. They're stuck in a cycle. They were here before you, and they'll be here after. You're just another piece in the puzzle." Sarah's stomach twisted in horror. The realization struck her like a slap to the face. She wasn't just a victim of this house. She was becoming part of it, bound by the very force that had claimed so many before her. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, their hands moving faster, as if they were counting down to something. "Get out of here," the woman begged, her voice desperate now. "Before it's too late." But before Sarah could respond, the clock stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the shelves filled with clocks now stretching toward her, their hands twisting and writhing like serpents. Sarah stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The room was changing, and she had no idea what was about to happen. But one thing was certain, she had to get out. But the door she had come through was gone. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, one so deep that Sarah could almost feel it pressing against her chest. She had tried to run, tried to find the door that had mysteriously disappeared. But there was no escape. The room, now alive with shifting shadows and twisted clocks, seemed to have closed in around her. She turned in a panic, her eyes darting from one corner of the room to another. Every inch of it felt wrong, distant, yet suffocating. The clocks on the shelves had started to tick again, louder now, their hands moving frantically as if trying to catch up to some unseen moment in time. But it wasn't just the clocks. The very walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ticking, as if time itself was alive, waiting. "Where did she go?" Sarah's voice cracked, her words faltering as they escaped her mouth. The woman, the one who had warned her, was nowhere to be seen. Was she part of the house too? Another lost soul, trapped in the endless loop of time that bound them all? Sarah spun around, desperate to find any trace of her. But all she saw were the walls, closing in like the jaws of a trap, suffocating her with their cold embrace. Tick, tick, tick. The sound grew louder. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing in time with the rhythmic beat of the clocks. She could feel it now, the presence. Something was watching her, waiting. She had no idea what it wanted, but she could feel its gaze on the back of her neck, icy and unyielding. Suddenly, the room shuddered. The shelves with their countless clocks seemed to groan under the weight of time itself. The wooden beams above her cracked, the sound echoing like thunder in the confined space. Then, with a low rumble, the walls parted, revealing an opening in the far corner. The air smelled musty, like the remnants of something long forgotten. But there was something else, something faintly sweet, yet unmistakably rotten. Sarah's stomach turned, and her hands trembled as she took a hesitant step forward. She didn't know what was beyond that doorway, but it was her only option. The air seemed less suffocating there, less heavy with the presence of the clocks. With one final glance at the room that was starting to collapse in on itself, Sarah moved toward the door. As she crossed the threshold, she found herself in another hallway, this one narrow and lined with faded wallpaper. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, their groans almost drowned out by the ticking from the room she had left behind. But it wasn't just the clocks that were following her now. A soft whisper echoed down the hallway, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. It was a voice, low and murmuring, barely discernible. Sarah stopped in her tracks, straining her ears to catch the words. Time, change, change. It was the woman's voice again, but now it was different, distorted, twisted, as though it were being filtered through layers of pain. The whisper was like a thread, delicate but unbreakable, pulling Sarah deeper into the unknown. The hallway stretched on forever, twisted and turned, its length impossible to measure. But something was urging Sarah to keep going. Each step she took felt as though it was leading her closer to something, closer to the heart of this nightmare. Her pulse quickened with each passing second. Help me, help me. The voice was now louder, more desperate. It echoed in the narrow corridor, bouncing off the walls, as if the house itself was trying to communicate with her. Sarah's mind raced. Was she hearing the cries of the trapped souls? Or was it something far darker, far more malevolent? She didn't have time to contemplate it. The air grew colder, and she could feel it. Something was watching her. Something ancient. Something alive. And then, ahead of her, at the end of the hallway, she saw it. A door no different from the others, yet somehow more inviting. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from within. The whispering grew louder as she approached, and she could feel her body tensing with each step. There was something waiting on the other side of that door. When she finally reached it, Sarah hesitated. She had no idea what lay beyond, but she had come this far. There was no turning back now. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but the shadows seemed to gather in the corners, swirling like smoke. It was a study, with tall bookshelves lining the walls, filled with old, dusty tomes. At the center of the room stood a desk, and on it a clock, one far more intricate than any she had seen before. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, its hands moving with unnatural speed, racing forward as though they were in a rush to reach the future. But it wasn't the clock that drew Sarah's attention. It was the figure sitting at the desk. A man, hunched over the desk, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, he didn't even seem to breathe. But there was something unmistakably chilling about him. It was the clockmaker. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the name, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. He was an enigma. His presence a dark force that seemed to warp the very fabric of the house. Without saying a word, the clockmaker slowly lifted his head. His eyes, cold and empty, locked onto hers. His lips curved into a slight smile, though there was no warmth in it, just a cold, knowing expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've come," he said, his voice deep and unsettling, like the creak of old wood. Sarah took a step back, her body trembling. She had no idea what he wanted, but something told her that he was not someone she wanted to face alone. "You're not supposed to be here," the clockmaker continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "This house, it's not for you." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "What do you want from me?" The clockmaker didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the pocket watch at his waist, slowly opening it, and the ticking that followed sent a jolt of fear through her. "You've already given more than you know," he said finally, his gaze unwavering. "Now it's time to pay the price." The ticking grew louder, overwhelming, drowning out every other sound in the room. Sarah's vision blurred as she felt the room start to spin, the edges of her sight darkening. She could hear her own heartbeat, frantic and erratic, drowning in the noise of time itself. And then, as if the universe itself had shattered, everything stopped. The ticking, the room, the house. It all came to a sudden, terrifying halt. In the stillness, Sarah could hear her breath, ragged and sharp, echoing in the silence. She dared not move, but she knew that something was wrong. The clockmaker was gone, but in his place, a figure stepped from the shadows. It wasn't the woman, it was someone else, someone worse. The air inside the room felt heavier now. The oppressive silence was replaced with a low hum, vibrating through the walls, through Sarah's very bones. She couldn't understand why, but something had changed. The very essence of the house had shifted, and with it, her sense of reality. The figure that had stepped out of the shadows, the one who had replaced the clockmaker, was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its form seemed to shimmer in and out of focus as though it was a ghost itself, existing only on the edge of her perception. Its face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but Sarah could feel its eyes, burning through the cloak of shadows that shrouded it. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically, and a sense of dread settled over her like a thick, suffocating fog. She could feel the presence of the entity, its power radiating through the room. But there was something else, something far more terrifying. The whispers returned, louder now. They came from every corner of the room, creeping up from the very floorboards beneath her feet. "Help me, save me." The voices were no longer faint and distant. They were clear, each one pleading with her, desperate for her attention. Some were familiar, people she had seen before, lost souls who had wandered the house for eternity. Others were new, strangers whose faces were hidden in the swirling mist of the room. Sarah couldn't make sense of it. She had thought she was the only one trapped here, but the whispers were clear now. This house had been a prison long before she had arrived. The lost souls, the victims of its twisted grip, were all around her, pleading for freedom that would never come. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, barely able to form the words through the growing terror that gripped her. The figures had shifted slightly, and in that fleeting moment, Sarah could swear she saw a glimpse of something. An eye, glowing red, piercing the darkness like a warning. Her heart raced, and she took a step back, her mind reeling with confusion and fear. "I am the keeper," the figure said, its voice low and cold, as though it were coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "I guard the souls of the lost, the souls who can never leave." The words sent a shiver through Sarah, but there was something else, a strange compulsion. She couldn't quite explain it, but it was as though the very essence of this being was pulling her in, drawing her closer to its dark power. "Why are they here?" Sarah asked, her voice steadying, despite the fear that gripped her chest. "Why are we all trapped?" The keeper remained silent for a long moment, its form shifting like smoke in the dim light. "The house is alive," it finally said, "and it feeds on the lost. Time is nothing here, it bends, it breaks. Those who enter never leave. Not unless they pay the price." "Pay the price," Sarah repeated, her heart pounding. "What price?" The keeper tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost human. "Time is the only currency here, and once you've given enough, it will ask for more. Takes from you your memories, your essence, your very soul. And when it's done, you'll be one of them." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her body trembled, and her mind raced. She thought of the clocks, their incessant ticking, the way they seemed to control the very fabric of the house. She thought of the whispers, the souls trapped in the walls, all doomed to repeat their fate forever. "But there must be a way out," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "I can't be the next one to disappear." The keeper's eyes, those glowing red eyes, seemed to pierce through her soul. "There is no way out," it said softly, as if the words were a death sentence. "You can try to escape, but the house will always pull you back. The house remembers. Sarah's mind raced as the weight of those words settled in. The house remembers. She had read about haunted places. Places where the spirits were bound by something far stronger than death. But this was different. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the souls trapped within its walls. "I won't give up," Sarah said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "I won't become one of them." For the first time, the keeper spoke with a hint of what might have been a chuckle, though it was cold and hollow. "You don't have a choice. Once you enter, you belong to it." The keeper raised its hand, and suddenly, the room around Sarah shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows growing longer, reaching out like fingers trying to grasp her. The air became thick with a strange, suffocating energy, and Sarah could feel herself being drawn into its grip. "No," she thought desperately. "I can't stay here. I won't." She spun on her heel and ran. The hallways twisted around her, the rooms merging and shifting, each corner more terrifying than the last. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and the whispers, those damned whispers, followed her, echoing in her ears, drowning out everything else. She had to escape, she told herself. She couldn't give in. She couldn't become another lost soul. But the house was relentless. No matter which direction she ran, the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, the darkness deeper. It was as though the house was swallowing her whole, pulling her into its depths, and she couldn't escape its clutches. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door, a familiar door, the one that had led her into the room with the clockmaker. She didn't know how, but she knew it was the key. It was her last chance. She ran toward it, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as her hand reached out to touch the handle, a voice, low, deep, and full of malice, stopped her. "Do you think you can leave?" The door slammed shut in front of her with a force that shook the entire house. "No one leaves." The keeper's voice echoed through the walls, reverberating in her mind. "No one." Suddenly, the house around her seemed to come alive, groaning, shifting, and twisting as though it were waking from a long slumber. Sarah could feel it now, the full weight of the house's power pressing down on her. The walls were alive with the whispers of the lost souls, their voices rising in a cacophony of despair. And somewhere, deep within the house, she knew the clock was ticking. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the voices that called to her from the shadows. The house seemed to breathe around her, each gust of air a whisper of despair, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the countless souls trapped within. She pressed her back against the cold door, her mind racing. The keeper's voice echoed through the hallways, twisting with malice. "You cannot escape, Sarah. The house is your prison now. You are one of us." Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned to face the darkened hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, the walls pulsating with an energy she couldn't explain. Every instinct told her to run. But where? The hallways were endless, and each door only led to more darkness. The house was alive, alive with a hunger that fed on the lost, on the souls trapped here for eternity. She needed to think, to find a way out, if such a thing was even possible. But every time she tried to focus, the whispers grew louder. They were everywhere now, crawling under her skin, tugging at her sanity. "Help me, please." Her hand trembled as it brushed against the cold, decaying walls. A faint memory flickered in her mind, the clockmaker, his creation, the clocks. She remembered his words, warning her that time could be manipulated, but at a terrible cost. Was this the cost? Was the house feeding on time itself, twisting it, breaking it down? Sarah looked down at her wrist. Her watch had stopped. The hands were frozen in place, as if time itself had decided to give up on her. But in that frozen moment, something caught her eye. On the wall opposite her, a faint symbol was etched into the wood. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, hidden in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. Could this be the key? Could this symbol lead her to the answers she so desperately sought? She ran her fingers along the grooves in the wall, her mind racing with possibilities. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each passing second, but Sarah refused to let them distract her. She focused on the symbol, tracing its shape with determination. It was old, ancient even, and it felt familiar, like something she had seen before, though she couldn't place where. And then it hit her. The clockmaker's workshop. The intricate designs on the clocks. The strange symbols carved into the wood. It was all part of the same puzzle. Her hand trembled as she pressed against the symbol. For a moment, nothing happened. The house remained silent, as if waiting. And then, click, the wall in front of her shifted. The sound was like the grinding of metal on metal, and the air grew heavier with an unnatural stillness. Sarah took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The wall slowly opened, revealing a narrow passageway bathed in dim, flickering light. She didn't hesitate. With her heart racing, Sarah stepped into the passageway, her hand brushing against the cold stone walls. The whispers, now distant, still echoed in her mind, but she pressed on. This was her chance, the only chance she had left. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing as she ventured deeper into the house. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to groan with every step. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about the keeper, the souls trapped in the house, and the dark force that seemed to control everything. But there was one thought that burned brightest in her mind. She had to keep moving. As she rounded a corner, she stumbled into a small room. It was nothing like the other rooms she had seen. This one was bare, almost sterile, with a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But at the far end of the room was something that made her blood run cold. A clock. A massive, ornate clock that seemed out of place in this otherwise empty space. Its hands moved with unnatural precision, ticking loudly, each second echoing through the room like a heartbeat. Sarah approached the clock cautiously, her eyes drawn to its face. The hands ticked with an eerie rhythm, faster than they should have, as if the very passage of time was being warped by its presence. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the clock's cold surface. The moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift around her. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with a strange energy. The clock's hands began to move faster, the ticking growing louder until it was deafening. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, more urgent than ever before. "Please, help us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned, her eyes frantically searching the room. The whispers were coming from the walls, from the very air around her. The room seemed to warp, and in the distance, she saw something. Someone. A figure, dark and formless, emerging from the shadows. It moved slowly, dragging its feet across the floor as though it were bound to the house, to the clock. It was one of them, a lost soul. And then another voice. A scream, sharp and high-pitched, ripped through the room. Sarah froze. The figure lunged forward, its form becoming clearer. It was a woman, her face contorted in terror, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic fear. The woman reached out to Sarah, her hand grasping the air, her mouth moving soundlessly, as if begging for help. And then crack, the sound of bones snapping, the air thick with a presence that was no longer human. Sarah backed away, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was closing in on her, its body stretching and warping in ways that defied nature. Its skin was gray and decayed, its eyes hollow, its mouth opening wider than seemed possible. It was no longer a woman. It was a thing, a soulless creature, its only purpose to drag Sarah into the darkness. Without thinking, Sarah turned and ran. The room behind her exploded into chaos, the walls twisting and warping as the very fabric of reality seemed to tear. The clock's ticking was deafening now, like the heartbeat of the house itself, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. She ran faster, her feet pounding against the cold stone floor as she tried to escape the thing that was chasing her. But it was everywhere. The shadows stretched out like tendrils, wrapping around her, pulling her back, pulling her into the abyss. The passageway seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the walls closed in tighter, as if the house itself were closing its grip around her. And then she saw it. A door at the end of the passage, just ahead, a way out. But as Sarah rushed toward it, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. She stopped dead in her tracks, her heart racing in her chest. She was trapped again. The clock's ticking grew louder, faster, until it was a steady, unrelenting rhythm, pounding through her skull. The walls were alive now, the shadows growing, the whispers rising to a crescendo. The thing behind her was close, so close. Help us. The voices reached a fever pitch, and the world around Sarah began to spin. She was running out of time, and then everything stopped. The ticking, the whispers, the chase, all of it vanished. And in the eerie silence that followed, Sarah knew she had made a choice. The house had claimed her, but she had also claimed something of her own. The clock was ticking. The silence in the air was deafening. Sarah stood motionless, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The clock's ticking had ceased, but the unsettling stillness was even worse, like the calm before a storm. The shadows around her seemed to have grown longer, stretching like gnarled fingers reaching for her. The whispers, though faint, still clung to her like cobwebs, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. She turned slowly, trying to steady herself, but the walls around her felt like they were closing in. Each step felt like it took her deeper into a nightmare, the weight of the house's history pressing down on her chest. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor beneath her feet groaned with each movement, as if it too was warning her to stop. You cannot escape. The voice was clear now, no longer a whisper but a direct command. It was the keeper, and his presence lingered in the room like a suffocating cloud. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had to get out. But how? Every path seemed to lead her back here, to the heart of the house, where the souls of the lost were trapped for eternity. She ran her fingers along the wall beside her, searching for any sign of escape. The walls, once cold stone, now felt like flesh, alive, pulsing with an unseen energy. The house itself was watching her, feeding off her fear, feeding off the time she had lost. Time, time. The word echoed in her mind, like a mantra she couldn't shake. It was what had brought her here, what had bound her to this place. The clock, the creation of the clockmaker. It was all connected. She could feel it now, the link between her and the house, between her and the souls that had died here. The clock was more than just a timepiece. It was a portal. It manipulated time, yes, but also the very essence of life and death. The souls trapped here hadn't just been killed. They had been torn from the flow of time itself, doomed to wander in this house forever. But Sarah wouldn't accept that fate. She was not like them. She still had time to break free. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the house groaned in protest. The air shifted, and she felt it. Something was coming. She spun around, her eyes widening in terror. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. The lost souls, the people who had died under mysterious circumstances. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted with anguish, their bodies marked by the passage of time. They moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps, their gazes fixed on her, unblinking. "You cannot escape," one of them whispered, its voice hollow and cold. Sarah backed away, her breath coming faster now. She had seen them before, the ghostly apparitions, the specters who had once been people, but they had become something else now. They were not just spirits. They were the echoes of time itself, shattered and fragmented. But one voice cut through the others, louder than the rest. "She's the key." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned, searching for the source of the voice. There, at the far end of the room, was the clockmaker. He stood there, his figure faint, like a shadow from the past, but his eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had watched her from the old photo she had found in the attic. You brought me here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The clockmaker nodded slowly. "It was never just about the house, Sarah. It was never about escape. It was about time. You see, time is not linear, can be bent, twisted, controlled. The clock was my masterpiece, but it was also my curse. I created it to control time, to cheat death. But in doing so, I broke the laws of nature. And now I am bound to this place, just like them." He gestured to the souls around her, who were closing in, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You were always meant to find me, to understand. You were never meant to escape without paying the price." Sarah shook her head, fear rising in her chest. "No, I won't become like you. I won't stay here, trapped forever." The clockmaker's face softened. "It's not your fault. The house feeds on time, and those who enter it are caught in its web. The only way to stop it is to destroy the clock. But in doing so, you will destroy all that remains of this house. You will release the souls and free yourself." The thought was almost too much to bear. Destroy the clock? The very thing that had caused all of this? Could she do it? Could she really destroy something so powerful, knowing the consequences? "The clock," Sarah whispered, her gaze falling to the ancient timepiece. The ticking had stopped, but the weight of its presence still loomed over her, suffocating. She looked around at the souls. Their faces were now expressionless, empty, as if they had resigned themselves to their fate. She could feel their despair, their longing for release, and she knew, deep down, that she couldn't let them suffer for eternity. She couldn't let herself be a part of that torment. The house seemed to shift again, as if the walls were watching, listening. The clock, it was the answer. It was the key. Without another word, Sarah turned and ran toward the clock. The souls let out a collective wail, their hands reaching out for her, but she ignored them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the clock's face, her fingers brushing against the cold, metallic surface. The moment her hand made contact, the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. The room spun, the shadows swirling around her, and for a moment, she felt herself being pulled into the clock, as if the very fabric of time were unraveling. But then, something unexpected happened. The clock began to break. The glass shattered, the hands snapped off, and the gears inside began to grind, spinning out of control. The house itself seemed to groan in pain, the walls cracking and buckling as if they could no longer contain the power of the clock. The souls screamed in fury, but it was too late. The house was collapsing. Time itself was being undone. Sarah stumbled backward, her vision blurring as the world around her disintegrated. But then, she saw it, light, bright, blinding light, cutting through the darkness. And then, silence. Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping. Her body felt heavy, but there was a strange sense of peace surrounding her. She opened her eyes, blinking in the sunlight. She was lying on the grass, outside the house. The house, it was gone. There was nothing left but the wreckage of what once was. The air was clear, the sky bright. She was free. But was she really? As Sarah stood up, she turned to look around. The memories of the house, of the lost souls, were still fresh in her mind. But they were no longer tormenting her. They had been released, freed from their eternal prison. And then, in the distance, she saw something. Someone. A figure standing in the shadows of the trees. It was the clockmaker, but this time his face was different. His eyes were filled with gratitude, not torment. "You did it," he said softly. "You freed us all." And with that, he faded away, like a breath of wind, leaving Sarah standing in the light of a new day. The lost souls were no longer lost, and Sarah, too, was free.